Guten Tag, mein Kameraden. I'm your host, Craig, as usual, and today we're going to be talking about the Panzer 3 medium tank, which is the German tank developed in the early 1930s, so around 1934. The development of this tank was led up by three or four different groups, so Daniel Benz, Krupp, Mann, Memetal, and all produced prototype tanks of this one, but testing of these took place in around 1936 and 1937, leading to the Benz design being chosen for production. The first model of the Panzer III, the Ausf A, or the Ost A, came out the assembly line in 1937. 10 of these, which were unarmed, were produced in that year. Mass production of the Ost F version began in 1939. Between 1937 and 1940, attempts were made to standardize parts between Krupp's Panzer IV and Benz Panzer III. Much of the early development work on a Panzer III was for the quest for a suitable suspension. Several varieties of the leaf-sprung suspension system were tried on the Ost A through D, and usually using an 8 relatively small diameter road wheels before the torsion bar suspension of the Ost E was standardized. Using the 6 road wheel design, this became the standard basically. The Panzer III, along with the Soviet KV heavy tank, was one of the early tanks to use the suspension design, first seen as the Stridsvagn L60 a few years earlier. A distant feature of the Panzer III, influenced by the British Vickers tank in 1924, was the three-man turret. This meant the commander was not distracted with another role of the tank, i.e. the gunner or loader, and he could fully concentrate on maintaining awareness of the situation, directing the tank, and most of the time it did not have the capability, providing the Panzer III with a combat advantage versus such tanks. For example, the French Suma S-35 turret was manned only by the commander, and the Soviet T-34 was originally had a two-man turret crew, and the Panzer III, as opposed to the Panzer IV, had no turret basket, merely a footrest platform for the gunner. So the Panzer III was intended as the primary battle tank of the German forces. However, it initially met the KV-1 and T-34 tanks. It proved to be inferior to boat armour and gunpowder, so to meet the growing need to counter these tanks, the Panzer III was gunned up with a longer, more powerful 50mm, about 1.97-inch gun, and received more armour. It still was at a disadvantage compared to the Soviet tank design. As a result, the production of self-propelled guns, as well as the gunning of the Panzer IV, was initiated. In 1942, the final version of the Panzer III, Ost N, was created with 75mm or 2.95-inch KV 37 L24 cannon. Was the same short-barreled howitzer like the used on the initial models of the Panzer IV, a low-velocity gun designed for anti-infantry and close support. For defensive purposes, the Ost N was equipped with heat round ammunition that could penetrate to around 70 to 100mm, so basically 2.76 to 3.94 inches of armor, depending on the round's variant, but these were strictly used for self-defense. A really cool, interesting fact about this tank that during the time, the Japanese government bought 2 Panzer IIIs from their German allies during the war. One had a 50mm and the other one had a 75mm gun. This was to be reverse engineered purposes, since Japan put more emphasis on development of new military aircraft and technology and had been dependent on European influence in designing new tanks. By the time the vehicles were delivered, the Panzer III's technologies was obsolete. So, this makes this tank very interesting, and how quickly it was left behind in the development cycle of tank development, basically. But this tank did have a lot of combat, though. It had a lot of combat uses. So the Panzer III was used in the campaigns against Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, and even in North Africa. A handful were still in use in Normandy and Anzio, Norway, Finland, and Operation Market Garden in 1944. In the Polish and French campaigns, the Panzer III formed a small part of the German armoured forces. Only a few hundred Ost A through F were available in these campaigns, most armed with a 37mm gun or a 1.46-inch gun. They were the best medium tank available to the Germans, and outclassed in both firepower and armour most of their opponents, such as the Polish 7TP or the, what was it called, the French R-35 and the H-35 light tanks, and the Soviet T-26 light tank and the BT cavalry tanks. Around the time of Operation Barbarossa, the Panzer III was numerically the most important German tank at this time. The majority of available tanks, including the rearmed Ost-E and F, plus the new Ost-G and H models, had the 50mm, so the 1.97-inch Kv-K38L 42 cannon, which also equipped the majority of the tanks in North Africa. Let's say it like that properly. But anyway, initially the Panzer IIIs were outclassed by the Soviet T-34 and the KV tanks. However, the most numerous Soviet tanks were the T-26 and the BT tanks. This, along with superior German tactical skills, crew training, and good, just generally contributed to the favourable kill ratio for the German tanks, of all German tanks in 1941. With the appearance of the T-34 and the KV tanks, rearming the Panzer III with a longer, more powerful 50mm gun was prioritised. The T-34 was generally invulnerable in frontal engagements with a Panzer III until the 50mm Kv-K39 L60 gun was introduced to the Panzer III Ost-J in the spring of 1942. The gun was based on the infantry's 50mm Pak-38. This could penetrate the T-34 frontally, ranges under around 500 meters, so about 1,600 feet. And against the KV tanks, it was a threat if armed with special high-velocity tungsten rounds. In addition to the counter anti-tank rifles in 1943, the Ost-L version began to be upgunned and up-armoured Panzer IV, and the Panzer III was after the Battle of Kursk. Relegated to a secondary role such as training, and it was replaced as the main German medium tank by the Panzer IV and the Panther. The Panzer III's chassis, though, on the good side of it, the basis for the turretless Stromgewicht, I believe it's okay, I can't pronounce it properly, but I'm going to say the proper word that we all know, which is the Stug, assault gun, was one of the most successful self-propelled guns of the war, the single most produced German armoured fighting vehicle design of World War II. By the end of the war, the Panzer III saw almost no frontline use, and many vehicles have been returned to the factories for conversion into the Stug assault guns, which were in high demand due to the defensive warfare style adopted by the German army by then. So, literally in-game, this tank does have its pros and cons. This is a German reserve tank, as we all know. It does have a battle rating of 1.0. The Panzer III Ost-B is a fast and maneuverable tank, and it can cross the battlefield at ease with a 37mm cannon that can destroy the majority of its targets. So, drawbacks of this vehicle is its thin armour and slow turret movement. I should mention that the early Panzer IIIs, like this one on screen here, had no electric turret drive, so that had to be turned manually by the crew, resulting in turret rotation speed being very slow, and also had a crappy reverse speed as well. So pros of this tank, by the way, are it's very fast and maneuverable, it has a crew of 5, has a great gun for a reserve tank. It's better than its rival, the T-26. It's basically a Panzer IIIe with weaker armour, the only reserve vehicle that has access to armour-piercing shells, and a good tank with to practice angling tactics that would be necessary later on with other tank models, other German tank models. I do want to point this out though. Given that, like I did say, it did take up a lot of its time with the the British Vickers tank, this was probably the most overlooked part of this tank, which was the three-manned turret design, which the commander could have more room to work. So that's why we always have a extra person on hand in case one of our gunners or our loaders get killed or knocked out. So the commander would actually take over the position of firing the cannon or reloading it. Overall, I actually enjoyed the hell out of this tank. This is a neat tank. It's a very powerful tank, especially for a reserve one. Even though it does have crappy armor, your best bet to using this, as I noticed with a lot of German tanks, they're more fitted to be fought in a urban setting than open area setting. I found out myself that I can easily get around on normal streets with this tank. It was pretty much made to siege cities at one point and fight other tanks. But It just amazes me with this tank that even though it's very weak armor, it can take a bit of a beating, but it does have that powerful gun, and you're able to take out enemies quicker, which is fantastic. I love that about it. But yeah, anyway guys, that's pretty much it for the moment. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. This is probably the most chock full of information yet. And also trying to pronounce German words with an Irish accent is literally impossible sometimes. But anyway, I do hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. And yeah, so if you liked the video guys, you can leave a like, or if you're new to the channel, subscribe. And if you want to hear some more tanks, about more tanks, and see more combat about them, yeah, don't be afraid to, say it down in the comment section, or you want to see a particular nation's tank which is accessible throughout Warthunder. And of course you can see some of my bad crappy driving. So anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and as I said before, thank you for watching, and of course also share it around if you have other friends who like tanks and history, or just generally like warfare in general, warfare games. So anyway guys, spoken enough. I'll see you guys next time on RTC. See you guys, have a good one.